Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're stepping into, well, a kind of intellectual wrestling ring. Think old Vienna, maybe a smoky cafe, ideas flying back and forth about what makes us human.
Exactly. And we're imagining two thinkers here. Let's call them person A and person B hashing things out. Person A, they've got this Freudian lens, really digging into morality, repression, culture, power, yeah, all that intense stuff.
And person B is, well, they're asking the tough questions, right? Not just accepting things at face value. The idea is to explore human nature, not like reading a textbook, but like overhearing, their raw thoughts and insights.
Let's dive in then. Person A, you look around, you see how we talk about men and women, the roles, the expectations. Does it make you wonder, are these differences just inherent? Or are they maybe reflecting something deeper? Societal anxieties, power plays, maybe like in that late 19th century Vienna context.
Ah, Vienna, yeah, that context feels really important, doesn't it? So rigid. Makes you think, are our modern ideas just like polished versions of those old rules? Person B, do you see things today that make you think, yeah, maybe our understanding of gender isn't purely objective?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, think about how easily we still slip into attributing certain emotions or, skills based on gender. Is that real or is it
Yeah.
just habit, echoes of the past? Person A, where do you see these societal anxieties popping up most clearly when it comes to gender?
Well, one place that jumps out is medicine. Historically, and honestly, even now sometimes, you hear about women's pain being written off as, oh, just emotional or hysterical. That term itself, hysteria, it connects right back to Freud's time, doesn't it? When straying from the norm got you a medical label.
And that wasn't just a neutral observation. It was tied up with Victorian ideas about how women should
Yeah.
behave, right?
Yeah.
Anything outside that box was seen as, well, pathological. What's really striking is how that pattern kind of persists, this tendency to doubt or invalidate experiences that don't fit the, let's say, male default.
So if that's happening, this need to define and pathologize, person B, what's driving it, do you think? Why would society want that kind of control over how we see gender?
It seems like it must be about maintaining some kind of order, yeah. Or maybe control, what's being protected by keeping these definitions so tight. Person A, you often bring up those deeper drives. Could something like Freud's idea of thanatos, the death drive, could that shed light on this almost aggressive push to categorize and control gender expression?
That's a really unsettling thought, that silencing people or enforcing norms could be like a defense mechanism against what change, difference. And person A, think about Freud's idea that women's issues sometimes stemmed from a perceived lack, seeing anatomical difference as deficiency. Does that sort of fit this pattern of pathologizing difference?
It fits almost too well, unfortunately. If you define a group by what they supposedly lack, then any difference becomes a problem needing fixing or containing. Person B, that makes you question the source, doesn't it? Freud's views. Were they pure observation, or was he maybe influenced by the very society he lived in?
Well, nobody's truly objective, are they? Person A, Freud, grew up in a pretty patriarchal setting. How much did his own life, his own experiences, maybe shape how he saw women? And maybe the bigger question is, how did those personal views get treated as, like, universal truths?
Yeah, the personal can definitely become universal, especially with someone influential. His own background, the power dynamics he saw that had to color his lens, and then his ideas presented with authority, they kind of bounced off the existing culture and reinforced it, right? Like a feedback loop. Maybe the repression he saw in patients mirrored what society was already doing. Person B, let's shift a bit. What about morality? How does that play into keeping these gender ideas in place?
Morality often seems to be the gatekeeper, defining good versus bad, acceptable versus not. Person A, Freud, thought civilization itself was kind of built on tamping down our instincts. How did that idea apply specifically to women? And did it show any, well, biases?
Oh, definitely biased. For men, repression was often framed as, necessary for order, responsible even. But for women, expressing similar drives, especially sexual ones, or ambition outside the home that was often seen as dangerous, disruptive.
A clear double standard.
Exactly. It shows these moral codes around gender aren't just pure ethics. They're often about managing specific cultural fears. Person B, so how does society actually do this? What are the tools for this control, often disguised as morality?
Usually psychological tools, right? Person A, you talk about things like repression, sublimation, displacement. How do those show up when it comes to controlling female identity?
Right, so repression is pushing down desires society doesn't like. Sublimation is channeling that energy into something approved, often motherhood or domestic life for women. Displacement is redirecting feelings onto safer targets. Society seems to actively steer female expression using these methods, and anything that doesn't fit gets labeled problematic or pathological. Person B, thinking about all this expectations, moral, psychological tricks, what about the power dynamics involved? Was Freud's therapy room somehow immune to all this?
The power aspect is huge, isn't it? Person A, the classic psychoanalytic setup, often a male analyst seen as the authority, and a female patient, often vulnerable. Couldn't that setup itself influence how her story gets interpreted? Could psychoanalysis, maybe unintentionally, have ended up reinforcing the status quo instead of just understanding the person?
It's really hard to imagine that intimate space being completely separate from the world outside. Just the act of going for analysis puts you in a certain power relationship. So person B, when we look at Freud's theories about women, considering all these layers, society, power, what's the big question we need to ask?
It has to be about whose view is being prioritized, right? Person A, were Freud's ideas about women actual discoveries about female psychology universally true? Or were they maybe, without him even realizing it, just reflecting and justifying the patriarchal world he knew? That famous line, anatomy is destiny. Does that sound like neutral science or something else?
It feels much more like a cultural judgment wrapped up in biology, doesn't it? Anatomy is destiny that neatly boxes women in, limits potential based on physicality. Person B, you brought up eros and thanatos earlier. How did those basic drives seem to get interpreted differently when applied to women in this context?
Well, even though they're supposed to be universal, the application seems really gendered. Person A, it feels like female eros desire, life force. If it wasn't aimed at having babies, it was often viewed suspiciously, maybe even seen as sick. Whereas thanatos, the death drive, maybe showed up as societal forces pushing against women's autonomy. Does that track?
Yes, it's like female desire outside the approved channels became a problem to be managed. And meanwhile, society's own destructive tendencies seem to work against women gaining independence, keeping them confined. Person B, what about one of the most controversial Freudian ideas? Penis envy. How does that fit into this discussion about power and gender construction?
Yeah, penis envy. On the surface, it sounds literal, like wanting male anatomy. But if you think about what the penis symbolized in that society, power, freedom, privilege, maybe penis envy is less literal and more about yearning for that stuff. The power women were denied.
Or even maybe it's projection. Like maybe it reflects male anxiety about female potential, a way to explain away power differences.
That symbolic reading makes a lot more sense. It shifts it from being about an inherent female lack to being about social inequality. And the projection idea is really interesting, blaming women for wanting what society reserves for men. Person B, what about the superego, that internal moral compass? How does that function for women in these patriarchal systems?
It often becomes like an internal police officer, doesn't it? Person A in that kind of society, wouldn't the female superego be particularly tough on things like female sexuality or ambition? Doesn't that create this deep internalized guilt if women feel desires that are out of bounds, which could then bubble up as anxiety or distress?
Absolutely. You internalize the rules, so you start policing yourself, constantly checking if your thoughts or feelings are acceptable. That internal battle, that self-monitoring, seems like it could definitely cause the kinds of psychological issues Freud saw. Person B, how about sublimation? Again, redirecting urges. How does that play out for women who are constrained?
Well, often it's less a healthy choice and more like being forced down a specific path, maybe one that isn't fulfilling. Person A, think of someone brilliant, maybe artistic, but society expects her to just run a household. Her creative energy gets sublimated into domestic tasks. Would you say that energy just vanishes, or might it reappear as like frustration, anxiety, even physical symptoms?
Exactly. The energy has to go somewhere. If it's blocked from its natural outlet, it can definitely fester and manifest in other ways. This kind of forced sublimation, stifling real passions. That sounds like a recipe for the problems Freud was trying to treat. Person B, looking back historically, are there moments that really starkly show this societal clampdown on female potential?
You could maybe point to something like the witch trials, centuries earlier. Person A, wasn't that a time of intense fear where women who showed independence, knowledge, maybe held some kind of power, weren't they the ones targeted? Could that be an extreme example of fearing and trying to crush female agency?
It's a really chilling parallel. Women outside the lines, women with influence, seen as dangerous.
Yeah.
You can almost see echoes of that fear in how female ambition or desire was later medicalized. Person B, with all these constraints, societal, moral, psychological, what was the cost to women's actual freedom, their ability to just be themselves?
A huge cost to their inner world, I'd imagine.
Yeah.
Person A, girls learn early on to kind of trim their sails, right? to moderate their desires, their ambitions, to fit in. Is it possible Freud saw this learned behavior, this adaptation for survival, and mistook it for just inherent female nature?
That seems entirely possible. What looked like feminine psychology might have just been the result of adapting to a restrictive environment for generations. Real inner freedom gets squeezed out. Person B, can you think of specific cultural things that show this suppression, this channeling of energy?
Well, the whole Victorian cult of domesticity is a big one. Person A, the idea that a woman's place was solely in the home, raising kids, intellectual stuff, creative stuff,
Right.
maybe as a hobby, but not serious. And then think about all those sentimental novels women read and wrote. Wasn't that kind of a safe zone for pouring out emotions and fantasies that had nowhere else to go?
Right, like cultural safety valves, managing female creativity and emotion, keeping it contained. Person B, let's look at Freud's own famous cases again, but through this lens of societal control, what starts to emerge?
They look less like straightforward medical cases and more like reflections of the times. Person A, take Dora. Remember how Freud interpreted her reaction to being harassed, or the Wolfman's dreams, where female desires seemed minimized or ignored? Don't those suggest Freud's own cultural biases might have been shaping his conclusions, maybe reinforcing the norms?
It's hard not to see those cases tangled up in the power imbalances of the day. A woman's account, especially about sex, often wasn't given the same weight. Freud's interpretations there seem to align more with what society expected than maybe what the patient was truly experiencing. Person B, back to that idea of instinct versus civilization, did Freud apply that evenly to men and women?
It looks pretty uneven. Person A, Freud said civilization needs repression, sure, but whose instincts got repressed or how? It seems men's desires were acknowledged, maybe managed, but women's were often just denied or called pathological. Doesn't that imply that maybe progress, as he saw it, kind of depended on keeping women subordinate?
That's a really challenging idea, but it feels hard to ignore. If progress requires systematically denying or twisting the natural impulses of half the population, well, you have to question the ethics of that progress. Person B, you mentioned guilt earlier. How does that work as a control mechanism, especially for women?
It's incredibly effective because it's internal. Person A, if you internalize the idea that women are somehow flawed or prone to messing up morally, especially with sex or ambition, you end up constantly watching yourself. That internalized feeling of being not quite right is way more powerful than just external rules. And Freud's theories, maybe unintentionally, might have given that idea more legitimacy.
Definitely. If you believe you're inherently deficient, you become your own jailer, enforcing the rules on yourself. Person B, what about thanatos again, the destructive drive? How might that show up in how society deals with women?
You can see it in the pushback against female success or autonomy. Person A, not just obvious discrimination, but also the subtle undermining. The ways women might internalize self-doubt, maybe even sabotage themselves. Could that be a kind of societal death drive aimed at any female power that rocks the boat?
A grim possibility that destructive energy gets channeled into limiting women. Person B, are there moments in history, maybe times of big change, that show how deeply embedded these repressive systems are?
The world wars are interesting examples. Person A, women stepped into men's jobs, proved they could do them.
Yeah.
But what happened afterwards? Huge pressure to go back to the way things were, back to traditional roles. It really shows how resistant these structures are, even when reality challenges them.
Yeah, the system snaps back, clinging to old patterns even when they don't make sense anymore. Person B, looking back over this whole discussion, how would you sum up Freud's views on women, given the context?
It seems less like objective science and more like, well, reflecting and maybe even justifying the anxieties and power structures of his era. Person A, his theories kind of set the stage for later ideas like the feminine mystique, didn't they? Blaming women's unhappiness on their own psychology rather than their restricted lives.
So instead of just understanding, the theories might have helped lock those limitations in place. Person B, what about looking outside Western culture? Do different societies challenge Freud's supposedly universal ideas about women?
Absolutely. They show how culture-bound his ideas really were. Person A, look at societies that are more egalitarian or even matrilineal. You see different patterns of female development, different expressions of identity, things that just don't fit the Freudian model of, say, penis envy being universal. It really suggests his observations were heavily shaped by Vienna.
It hammers home how crucial that cultural lens is for any theory about people. Person B, given how influential Freud became, how did these specific ideas get so baked into our thinking?
It was a powerful spread, wasn't it? Yeah. Person A, his ideas moved through academia, medicine, psychology, even seeped into popular culture. It created this cycle where the theories shaped how people thought, which then seemed to confirm the theories. A real feedback loop.
Like a dominant story that becomes hard to even see as just one story. Person B, we talked about managing psychological energy. How is that applied restrictively to women?
Women's energy creative, intellectual, sexual, extamulist had. It was often carefully steered into safe channels. Person A, think about limited access to education, professions, the arts. The main channel was supposed to be wife and mother.
So potential wasn't just ignored, it was actively managed, contained. Person B, did this management have any unforeseen results? Maybe things Freud didn't quite see?
Possibly. I mean, the domestic sphere, while restrictive, also became a place where women developed their own kinds of influence. Person A, they built networks, managed complex family dynamics, wielded emotional intelligence, ways of having power that maybe weren't visible if you were only looking for public male-style power, maybe subtle forms of resistance or just making the best of it.
That shows resilience, finding agency even within constraints. Person B, how have mental health labels for women changed over time, and does that reflect these ongoing issues?
You see a shift, right, from things like hysteria or neurasthenia in the past to, say, certain personality disorder diagnoses today. Person A, the names change, but you could argue there's still an underlying tendency to pathologize women who don't fit neatly into expected emotional or behavioral boxes. The anxiety about female nonconformity just gets new labels.
So the language evolves, but the core impulse might persist. Person B, you keep coming back to the observer's position. How did Freud Freud, a prominent male doctor in that society, how did that inevitably color his view of his female patients?
His authority carried so much weight. Person A, his patients came to him seeking help, already in a less powerful position. And their stories, their experiences were all filtered through his understanding, which was itself shaped by his background, his status, his gender in that specific time and place.
It's a stark reminder that pure objectivity, especially when studying humans, is probably impossible. Person B, as we wrap this up, what's the key thing to understand about Freud's mistakes regarding women?
Maybe that they weren't just random errors, but part of a pattern. Systematic biases that mirrored and maybe even reinforced the power structures around him, all while seeming like neutral science. Person A, it's a powerful lesson about how easily cultural biases can weave themselves into our attempts to understand ourselves.
So the errors tell us more about the society, perhaps, than about universal female nature. Person B, how do these errors still echo today?
They're still subtly around, I think. Person A, many underlying assumptions, maybe softened or rephrased, still linger in how we talk about gender, maybe even in some psychological ideas. Just recognizing those deep roots is a huge step.
It shows how much we're all downstream from this intellectual history. Person B, what's the big lingering question this whole intense conversation leaves us wrestling with?
It really makes you question if any theory about human nature can ever be truly free from its cultural baggage. Person A is someone like Freud, with his intellect, was so influenced. How can anyone achieve pure objectivity? Does trying to theorize about people always mean imposing a cultural frame? Maybe the real value isn't finding the final answer, but staying critical, always aware of our own potential blind spots.
That's a very potent thought to end on. Thank you for diving into this really complex, sometimes uncomfortable territory.
It was fascinating to explore.
So today's deep dive took us right into that charged space where society shapes how we understand ourselves, especially around gender, using Freud's work as a kind of historical mirror. It felt intense, like those Viennese debates we imagined.
And it leaves us, and hopefully you listening, with a real challenge, doesn't it? To keep questioning our own assumptions, to notice how culture subtly steers our perceptions, and to aim for a view of people that's, well, less biased, more nuanced.
We really encourage you to keep thinking about these connections between gender, power, identity, and the stories we tell ourselves about them. Keep that curiosity alive. Thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive.